Can Rex Tillerson's first big mediation mission bear fruits? After Kuwait, the UN, the foreign ministers of Germany and Britain, the new U.S. Secretary of State trying to play peacemaker between Qatar and a quartet of angry Saudi-led neighbors. Tillerson landing in Jeddah with a memorandum of understanding where the Qataris pledged to cooperate in the fight against terrorism. Not enough, say his hosts, if Tillerson's going to have any chance of diffusing what's turned into a land and air blockade of the tiny emirate. Well, it'll only happen if his boss has his back. That's not a given. Remember Donald Trump's May visit to Riyadh and his subsequent tweets that seemed to side with the Saudis in their dispute with Doha. The U.S. president's gone quiet so far this week. Has he morphed into a more honest broker? What is U.S. policy? You might be tempted to also ask, well, what's a terrorist? The latest revelations over demands by Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt make clear the dispute is not about ISIS or Al-Qaeda, but Qatar's backing of the Muslim Brotherhood, elected to power in 2012 and overthrown a year later. What's a terrorist? Why is it all coming to a head now? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Rex Tillerson to the rescue. With us, former U.S. diplomat William Jordan. Welcome back to the show, sir.
Thank you. Happy to be there.
From Qatar's capital, Omar Ashour, who teaches at the University of Exeter, non-resident fellow at Brookings, Doha. Thank you for being with us.
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you.
And from Dubai, Alison Wood, we can hear you too, Middle East and North Africa analyst with Control Risks in Dubai. Thanks for joining us. The France 24 debate on Facebook and on Twitter at the hashtag F24debate. Now, this crisis broke out on June the 19th, but I'll begin with you, William Jordan. Was it Tillerson's boss that unwittingly triggered the whole mess by gushing his support for the Saudis in May? Did that sort of give them the green light to isolate Qatar?
Well, I don't think it was Trump's intention to do this, and I doubt that the Saudis or anybody else really talked to Trump or anyone else about specifically what they were planning to do. But clearly, I think the Saudis decided that with Trump's visit and with the symbolism and everything that he said while he was in Riyadh, basically praising the Saudis for their leadership of this counterterrorism effort, that it emboldened the Saudis, who have been, let's remember, from the very beginning of this administration, have been courting the Trump administration in the hope that there would be a serious and dramatic break from what the Saudis considered to be a hesitant at best, a hostile at worst relationship with Barack Obama and a perception of them. And so I think that again, I think that all of this is following a Saudi timetable. I think that the Saudis are driving this. It was just very fortunate that this event happened in Riyadh. Let's remember, the Emir of Doha, or the Emir of Qatar, was there as well and met with Trump. So I don't think this was a setup, but I do think that the Saudis maybe not took it as a green light, but they skillfully manipulated the situation and put the United States, as well as other Western partners of both countries, in a difficult situation, especially since the Saudis have decided to press this to the max.
Alison, would you agree that Donald Trump may have acted as, unwitting catalyst for this crisis?
I do think that the change in U.S. position has certainly, as William was saying, given a sort of green light to the Saudis and Emiratis to try to force Qatar more in line with foreign policy objectives and regional objectives that they've really, I guess, professed over the past couple of years in particular. And I do think that sort of the lack of unity on the U.S. side has allowed the crisis to persist, as we've seen over the past month now. I think that has given space, essentially, for both sides to look towards different aspects of the U.S. administration for support of their own views.
Why is this happening besides what's interpreted as a green light, even if it's not intentional on the part of Donald Trump? Why suddenly now?
I think we've seen throughout as the conflict has progressed, we've seen this list of demands. We've also, over the past couple of days, seen the release of the Riyadh Agreement that was signed in 2013 and 2014. And I think that what that's shown is that, this conflict, while it was ostensibly centered around terrorism financing, there are a variety of issues at play here that really have been longstanding for several years and date back not just to the rule of the current Emir of Qatar, Tamim, but really back to his father's rule, and really even predating that, as his father sort of gained prominence within the Qatari government. So I think, there's a number of different issues that have gone into contributing to the current crisis that we see. And I think for that reason, the agreement that we saw signed the other day by Tillerson and the Emir of Qatar with regards to terrorism financing really will not go a long way towards resolving the dispute as we see it right now because of this confluence of issues.
Yeah, and those talks in Jeddah that we mentioned at the outset, they're now over for the day. Rex Tillerson, who met with the king, with the crown prince, and representatives of those three other nations. Now, he arrived in Jeddah with this memorandum of understanding the day before, memorandum of understanding between Doha and Washington.
The memorandum lays out a series of steps the two countries will take over the coming months and years to interrupt and disable terror financing flows and intensify counterterrorism activities globally. Together, the United States and Qatar will do more to track down funding sources, will do more to collaborate and share information, and will do more to keep the region and our homeland safe.
Omar, sure, what are we supposed to make of this memorandum?
Well, I think it's more of a legal framework or a diplomatic framework for further cooperation on security matters. Having said that, the Qataris were quite cooperative with the Americans beforehand. So I think what it signals is more that if you want us to, kind of undermining the claims or an outmaneuver, if you wish, by the Qataris for the demands from the Saudis and the Emiratis. What is saying in an indirect way is that, well, the leaders or the leader of the war on terror here is the US, and here we are signing a memorandum with them to fight terrorism. So kind of back off. You're not the ones who are leading that war, and the leader is okay with that. So this is a very classic, if you put it in international relations, this is like when you have a regional brinkmanship of some sort, you have the international power or the global superpower telling it, stop here. There is no space for further brinkmanship because there's too many issues that are going on for this administration at the moment: the fight against Daesh, the fight against Al-Qaeda, the North Korean escalation. The last thing it needs is a war between its allies in this very sensitive region, and the last thing it needs is an escalation where some of its rivals or even enemies like Iran and Russia intervene in this very sensitive region.
Yeah, but
so
just Omar, let me ask you about this.
The framing of this in a very simple memorandum.
I was going to say. When it talks about fighting terrorism, it's a bit vague. What are they referring to specifically?
Well, terrorism, we are 17 years after 9/11 almost, and the UN General Assembly cannot agree on a definition of terrorism. But I think when we say terrorism, we're probably referring to ISIS, Al-Qaeda, the like-minded jihadi organizations, here in the region. In a very abstract sense, well, terrorism, the part of the definition that everybody agrees about is that if you target civilians by violence for political purposes, then you're a terrorist. So I guess, and eventually it's a tactic, as academics say, it's not actually an entity, it's a tactic used for political purposes by targeting civilians. So hence the very vague term of the war on terror, it's a war on a tactic, which doesn't make any sense. But in a very, I think the memorandum has much more political and diplomatic significance more than a military or a security or an escalation in security cooperation.
From where you're
and of
sitting,
course,
Omar,
it doesn't make sense legally as well because the cooperation was already there from the beginning.
Omar, from where you're sitting in Doha, what irks the Saudis and the Egyptians and the Bahrainis and the Emiratis the most about Qatar?
I think Alison referred to several factors, but I think the most dominant factor has to do with the Al Jazeera role in expanding the margin, in the idea of hosting opposition, hosting status quo figures, but hosting also opposition figures. And then the impact of that happened, that assisted in the Arab uprisings. I don't think it's about the Muslim Brothers specifically. The Muslim Brothers are represented legally in Bahrain, in one of the blockade countries, in Kuwait. I don't think Saudi Arabia hosted them for a very long time, and still until now there are members of the Yemeni and the Syrian and even the Egyptian Muslim Brothers are based in Saudi Arabia. I don't think it's specifically about Iran because Oman has a much better relations with Qatar. Qatar was kind of at a proxy war with Iran under Saudi-led coalition. The UAE has a trade surplus with Iran, so it's not specifically about Iran. I don't think it was specifically about the US base here or the Turkish base here. Both of them, have as well good relations with the Saudis specifically, or relatively good relations. But I think it was specifically about Al Jazeera's impact, if you wish, in many ways. This margin of freedom. I mean, France 24 does the same thing, but France 24 is based in Paris and can always be dismissed as, the old imperial power giving the margin of freedom for, the minorities or for opposition for a global conspiracy. But when you're based here in the region, in the Arab region, in the Gulf, then it's a very different impact. And then the idea that the belief, I think mainly by the Egyptians, that it's not the socioeconomic grievances of the Mubarak regime, it's not the political grievances or the political repression that Mubarak has caused, but it was just Al Jazeera that galvanized all these hundreds of thousands on Egyptian streets and led to the toppling of the regime and destabilizing the country. So I think this is the real issue back there. It's not terrorism, it's not Iran, it's not Turkey, it's not the US, it's mainly that margin of freedom. Man.
William Jordan, you agree that, it's been 4 years since the coup that overthrew the Muslim Brotherhood-backed government in Egypt, that the Saudis, for them, the number one grievance is still Al Jazeera television?
Well, I don't know if it's necessarily the number. I might not entirely agree with what Omar just said. I mean, but what he and Alison have said, I think, are correct. I mean, it's an amalgamation of issues that have all come to a head now. There's this opportunity that the United States, with Trump's visit, gave, and indeed the whole transition in Washington.
But again, hold on, William. You have, again, it's been more than 4 years since the Muslim Brotherhood was chased from power in Egypt. You have the emir's father, who's stepped down in Qatar.
Well, look, if there's anything I knew, I learned early on when I was in Saudi Arabia 30 years ago, my first diplomatic assignment, it was that one should never underestimate the degree to which the Saudis are scared of technology and are very paranoid about anything in terms of information flow that they cannot control. Back in the early 1980s, the big issue wasn't the internet, it was a fax machine. And the Saudis were very paranoid about fax machines and did everything that they could to control them. I mean, I think that, ironically, broadcasting in the Middle East, I mean, we saw this back in Nasser's time. Broadcasting in the Middle East has always been a very powerful medium because it's not easy to block. And if, as Nasser did, you are trying to put forth a radical message of liberation, including in places like Saudi Arabia. Let's remember, again, I'm sorry to delve into all of this history, but at one time, Saudi Arabia was arrayed against Egypt over a war in Yemen. And the agenda of the Nasser regime was to needle the Saudis. Flash forward to today. I mean, I don't think it's a question of Qatar necessarily looking to needle Saudi Arabia, Egypt, or these other countries, but they have decided in Doha for years to use Al Jazeera as a force for an exchange of ideas and a presentation of different points of view that is not comfortable to most of the Arab world. The Muslim Brotherhood angle comes into play in part because of the nature of the people that that Al Jazeera tends to host in Doha itself, being preachers who tend to espouse a very radical ideology, and they're not Qataris. They're people from a lot of these countries who have amassed a large following. But it's the fact that, I mean, again, the starting point is that Al Jazeera, as far as I know, remains not merely one of the freest broadcasters among the Arab broadcasters in the region, but it is also a broadcaster that the Saudis and others have not been able to rival. I mean, the viewership remains, something that they cannot get into, and so the influence. This is what everybody talks about: Qatar punching above its weight. Now, I do think that there's a further political agenda that has to do with the Muslim Brotherhood, what the Muslim Brotherhood and that form of Islamism represents in Qatari eyes, and that's inevitably going to be a source of friction and problem, especially when you're talking about a country like Egypt.
All right, we'll talk about the Muslim Brotherhood in part 2 of our discussion. But before we go to the break, Alison Wood, you agree that Al Jazeera is the issue that irks the Saudis the most?
I think it's certainly an important component of sort of the issues that the Saudis and Emiratis and their allies have with Qatar, but I hesitate to think that it is the one and only thing. I mean, I think it's unrealistic to think that Qatar will concede to shut down Al Jazeera as the list of 13 demands made. And I think it's also not just it's not just what the platform that Al Jazeera has given to a number of different actors and really push the margins, as Omar was saying, but I think it also has to do with the ways in which Qatar has really acted on its foreign policy across the region as well. I mean, we've seen increasing intervention on the part of Qatar, and not just Egypt, but in other areas across North Africa. And I think that has also fed into irking the Saudis and Emiratis as well, given that they have also increasingly had their own interests and become increasingly involved in these regions as well. So I do maintain that I think it's a confluence of these issues, although Al Jazeera is certainly an important component of that.
All right, when we come back, we'll talk more about what the Muslim Brotherhood means to those four nations, and also how Rex Tillerson is doing his diplomatic tour. He's not finished yet. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're looking at Rex Tillerson's Middle East mediation over the Qatar crisis. He was in Doha on Tuesday. This Wednesday, he visited Jeddah, met with the King of Saudi Arabia, representatives of a quartet of nations who are blockading Doha. We're talking about it in the company of former U.S. diplomat William Jordan, from Qatar's capital, Omar Ashur, who teaches at the University of Exeter, non-resident fellow at the Brookings Doha Center, and from Dubai, Alison Wood, Middle East and North Africa analyst with Control Risks. Many thanks for all three of you for being with us. Ahead of this Wednesday meeting, you knew it wasn't there wasn't going to be a big breakthrough. The Gulf states putting out a formal communique stating that the bilateral agreement that we talked about in part one on that was announced on Tuesday between the U.S. and the Qataris, quote, wasn't enough. On that score, on Monday, CNN leaked documents from a secret deal a few years back between Gulf Cooperation Council states in which members pledged not to interfere in each other's domestic affairs and to cease all support for the Muslim Brotherhood. Qatar's foreign minister reacting on Tuesday in the company of Rex Tillerson.
These leaks are part of a media campaign that says Qatar has broken its commitment to the Riyadh Agreement, and these are all false. The state of Qatar is utterly committed to this agreement, and there is proof of this. Also, this is an agreement for all and does not only pertain to Qatar.
Jordan, what's your reaction to that when you hear that from the Qatari foreign minister?
Well, the charge that the Qataris are somehow the font of all incitation, for the Muslim Brotherhood is, needless to say, quite exaggerated. It's an insult to the Muslim Brotherhood to make the charge in the first place, since it defies one of the fundamental aspects of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is that there may be the Muslim Brotherhood movement may have started out of one set of teachings or one set of ideologies developed by an Egyptian, decades ago. But every Muslim Brotherhood that I am aware of has developed a unique national standing and status and identity of its own.
But there is an international organization of which Qatar is a member, and so is Turkey.
Perhaps, but the thing is, the actual dynamic is not like we're not talking about the Communist Party. We're not talking about something, that has funding that involves how do I put it, a sort of a call and response direction from a central organization. And I think that, but in the minds of a lot of these regimes, the Saudis, on the one hand, the Egyptians in particular, given the extremely tortured history of the relationship that various successive Egyptian regimes have had with the Muslim Brotherhood, it's inevitable that as far as they're concerned, it is a binary sort of, or it is a war against, a centrally or a directed evil, often inspired from outside. But the actual play of these, this is why I think that I don't agree with the interpretation that, for example, that Doha, through Al Jazeera, is putting forward an interpretation that political Islam, as represented by the Muslim Brotherhood, is ipso facto the future of the region. I do, however, believe that political movements like the Muslim Brotherhood and the doctrines that they espouse are inevitably going to be play some kind of a part, as they did with the Arab Spring, in taking the region into a different political direction, which at some point it is going to do. The repressive regimes at some point, as has already been proven on numerous occasions, can only last so long. And so, whether it's with some sort of a federating ideology, as we once saw with Baathism or what was loosely called Nasserism, or if it's Muslim, something embodied by the Muslim Brotherhood, I don't know. But this is not a case that, I don't believe that it's a case that Doha is necessarily, along with Ankara, giving the marching orders to the extent that everybody says. They are a convenient scapegoat or whipping boy as far as claiming that this menace exists.
All right, but on Tuesday, while Rex Tillerson was in Doha, Qatar's representative for reconstruction was in Gaza. He insists that he wasn't there to support Hamas, which is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, but the Palestinian Authority with cash pledges. He spoke in the company of a UN official. Alison Wood, when we look at those images of that Qatari representative in Gaza on Tuesday, what is the relationship between Qatar and the Muslim Brotherhood?
Well, I think, like William was saying, it's not perhaps as straightforward, I think, as some would make it out to be. Yes, Qatar has provided financial support to Muslim Brotherhood organizations across the region, in Gaza and in Egypt and elsewhere. I think they do see this as part of a sort of what they view as the long-term future of the region, and sort of a political project in which they believe that this sort of supporting these movements now may serve to protect their own interests over the long run. Qatar's been a supporter of Hamas and Gaza for in terms of humanitarian aid for the past 5 years. Really, it's donated hundreds of millions of dollars to efforts in that area. But I do think this is an area in which we have started to see this conflict, I guess you could call it, bleed into other parts of the region. You've seen increasing sort of disputes within Hamas, different factions, some of which are backed by the UAE, for sort of political power in Gaza. And I think, we've seen that also in parts of Libya as well, the early stages of that. So I do think that kind of speaks to the ways in which these states have involved themselves increasingly throughout really the Middle East and North Africa over the past 2 years in particular. And that I think some of the differences they have over the long-term vision of the region and their involvement in that are starting to come to a head. And the Muslim Brotherhood and sort of its associated organizations are one of the ways, one of the issues over which that contention is really becoming clear.
But seen from the outside, Alison, what we have this announcement from Turkey of deploying a fifth wave of troops to Doha, rushing to the rescue of Qatar, announcing as well along the way another 200 cargo planes to break that embargo. There is a sense that there's a sort of a pro-Muslim Brotherhood crowd and an anti-Muslim Brotherhood crowd.
I do think that's a fair characterization in terms of Turkey's general ideology, and I think there is absolutely a certain ideological bond that some of the leaders of Qatar and some of the leaders of Turkey do share. I mean, I think it's also important to mention in that case in particular, we've seen, while securing Turkish support, I think was important for Qatar in the early days of this crisis and really has allowed it to, maintain its independence throughout this crisis. I do think that relationship is not one that's altogether new. We've seen increasing cooperation and relations between those two states over the past several years, both economically and militarily. So I think these are two states that have found common interests across the region and have been, in many ways cultivating that bond over the past several years. I think that, we also at the same time have seen increasing sort of anti-Muslim Brotherhood and anti-Iran sentiments from other parts of the region, in particular Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Although I do think it's important in this case to note that there is a spectrum of sort of anti-Muslim Brotherhood sentiment among these countries. I would say the UAE, for example, is much more staunchly against the Muslim Brotherhood than Saudi Arabia is, for example. I think there's a bit more flexibility in their policy towards associates of the broader ideology within Saudi than there is here in the UAE.
Omar Ashur, what's the street cred, if you will, of the Muslim Brotherhood right now after being, again, chased from power 4 years ago in Egypt? How much of a threat to President Sisi and to the Saudis?
I don't think there's much, really. If we can do surveys, obviously, in Egypt at the moment because of the situation, we can never do surveys in Saudi Arabia, again, because of the ruling environment. So we don't know how much credibility they have. All the data we had is basically from 2012, the end of 2012, and we saw then that they have about 5 million in terms of support. Egypt at that point had 51 million voters, eligible voters, so about 10%. But the thing with Egypt is that the maximum number of voters that turned out were about 50%, were about 26 million. They turned out in the parliamentary elections. That was the largest number of voters ever in Egypt history, just half of the eligible ones. And when you turn out in that number, of course, the 5 million, and sometimes with coalition, you can reach the 10 million. So it's a significant number, and they can pull, as we saw, small majorities, like 51% of Morsi, for example, with a big coalition. It was not just the Muslim Brothers, it was them with other coalition, including seculars, or with the Democratic Alliance, between quotations, in the parliament, which was led by the Muslim Brothers, but it had around 11 other parties. Most of them were non-Islamist parties. But just briefly on the international organization, because the international organization of the Muslim Brothers exists, yes, it's a reality, yes. The only time that it was serving more than a discussion forum were in the 1930s. If you looked at all of the crises that went through from the Algerian coup in 1992 to the invasion of Iraq in 2003 to the Saddam invasion of Kuwait in 1991, the Muslim Brothers, really, the international organization, failed to take one stance. So the Algerian Muslim Brothers would support a coup in 1992 against another Islamist party, the FIS, but the Egyptians would refuse to support that coup. The invasion of Iraq, the Iraqi Muslim Brothers supported the intervention by the Americans. The Egyptian Muslim Brothers refused the intervention, and so on and so forth. So, in Kuwait, the Muslim Brothers were against women's suffrage, were against giving the right to vote for women until 2000. At the same year, the Egyptian Muslim Brothers were fielding female candidates in the parliamentary elections. So, the organization, the idea that there is one leadership with a centralized international branch is just a myth. That the Muslim Brothers like to propagate, but it's not a reality. But also, this is a non-state international organization. So Turkey and Qatar are not members of it. You have figures that are Qataris and Turks in it. But also you have Saudis, you have Emiratis, you have Kuwaitis, you have Sudanese, Tunisians, and so on. So this is just for clarification on that dimension.
Right,
but I think the current crisis is a lot bigger than the Muslim.
A lot bigger than the Muslim Brotherhood. A lot of reactions coming in.
We can talk about it if you want, but it's a lot bigger.
A lot of reactions coming in on the hashtag F24 debate. Apologies for the delay there with the connection. One of them, everyone in the world uses the word terror, so it serves its own purpose. That's not only in the case of the Gulf Cooperation Council. And we can give you also this one from Nate on Twitter. Qatar agreeing to curb terrorist financing based on U.S. definition, not that of Saudi Arabia or UAE. Good move, but not how this ends. Of course, that's a reference, William, to that bilateral deal we talked about earlier. I haven't asked you, how is Mr. Tillerson doing in this mediation effort?
Well, I think I'll try to be kind, but it's hard to be under the circumstances. I mean, I think he's basically doing what he can in an extremely challenging situation. Less diplomatically, I think he's flailing. I think he's trying to come up with anything that will sort of put a ceiling on the tension, so that he can begin to, he and others can begin to ratchet it down.
But when they announced that bilateral agreement on Tuesday, it was like pulling a rabbit out of a hat almost. It said, this puts the onus on the quartet.
It has. I mean, as far as I can tell, I mean, I haven't had a chance to see whatever fuller public explanation of the agreement there is. But it just sounds like the usual half measure that you pull out in the hope that you can at least show that you're doing something. You have a deliverable, as they call it in diplomatic speak. And I think that the problem that Tillerson has is that first of all, as you sort of mentioned at the beginning of the program, there's a certain extent to which he's sort of undermined potentially by the tweets of the man in charge in Washington. He's also representing the largely civilian part of the U.S. government, which doesn't necessarily see things the same way that the military.
Will the military be on the same page, since they have bases both in Bahrain and in Qatar?
Well, I think if you unpack all of this, yes and no. I mean, I think that as far as the military base is concerned, and the need to keep the fight, or keep the focus firmly on the fight against Islamic State, and to protect core U.S. interests in the region, you're absolutely right. On the issues of Iran and the immediate threat that Iran poses, I still think that the civilian part of the U.S. government, despite Donald Trump and despite the change of administration, has a much more nuanced view than the military does, which tends to say repeatedly that Iran is the number one threat. But to describe the dynamic, the thing that Tillerson is really facing is that as far as he is concerned, what he's dealing with are people in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, the hardliners, even Egypt, who are basically saying, okay, you can't tell us what to do because we are your customers in what is one of the most lucrative areas of U.S. arms contracts. We are also the people who are receiving the services that you provide in terms of military and intelligence cooperation, not to mention a certain amount of political cooperation. It's very much a situation where Tillerson is finding that he has very little leverage, and that he cannot ask very much of the Saudis because they are actually the ones who are in the dominant position. So,
Alison Wood, your job is to weigh both political and economic risk. Here we're talking about an oil man who knows all these leaders well from his previous life. Is a former head of Exxon the right person for this particular job?
Well, I think that's something that we'll find out over the coming weeks. I mean, this is really Tillerson's first real test, I think, of a diplomatic crisis as Secretary of State. And so far, I think, like William was saying, we're getting sort of mixed reviews. I mean, he was a bit reluctant, I think, to really weigh in the early stages of the crisis. And then we saw some much stronger statements come out of the State Department using terms like mystified with regards to the 13 demands that the Quartet of Nations put out. I think his trip to the region is sort of a significant escalation in terms of U.S. involvement in the crisis, but I'm not particularly optimistic that it's going to achieve any really measurable results. And even the statements that the State Department is making, doesn't really lend itself to making any promises. I mean, they've said that this is more about finding common ground than it is anything else. And I think also that Tillerson is going to find that this is not sort of, I mean, on the one sense, this is a situation where both sides at some point are going to have to compromise, right? I mean, it's clear that the Qataris are not going to concede and back down and concede to the demands that are being made upon them. Likewise, the other states are going to be very reluctant to walk away from this as well, given sort of the importance that they put on these demands and on this conflict. I think, though, that there's an element of this that is, revolves around sort of long-term grievances and in some ways, personal relationships that I think go beyond a business-style negotiation and really, tread more into the realm of diplomacy. And I think really his track record there is unproven at this point.
Unproven at this point, Omar Ashur?
Yeah, I agree with both Alison and William. Just, I think what the Qataris did in terms of providing or offering the German intelligence to look at their files and see if there is, any fishy issues with them. I think they may also, this may get escalated to ask the others as well, especially the Saudis and the Egyptians, to open their files. And if that happens, I think there will be some balance here, because with the Saudis specifically, this is a very, very sensitive topic. And if the files got open, then especially with regards to what's happening in Europe at the moment, with regards to supporting or having some accusations against them of supporting hate speech or sectarianism and so on and so forth, then things may get a little bit escalated, or as a result, de-escalate and calms down and leave the houses of glass in their situation at the moment.
Omar Ashur, I want to thank you for joining us from Doha. I want to thank Alison Wood in Dubai, William Jordan. Stay with us, though. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to Emma James.
Hi there.
We heard Alison Wood saying, for now, Rex Tillerson, unproven. It's his biggest test, perhaps also a test of how he handles his boss.
Yes, absolutely, because there have been quite a few reports that perhaps these two men aren't always on the same page. Among the things that I've seen looking around today, Slate is reporting that he is trying to diffuse the Gulf crisis, while Donald Trump simply isn't helping. What they say is that Donald Trump has very much aligned himself with the Saudi way of thinking, and he really isn't involved in any kind of push for reconciliation. But what they also say is that while Tillerson arriving there on his diplomatic mission could mark a new chapter. He does favour a more reconciliatory approach, but will it happen? It's not the only area that we're seeing reportedly of some disagreement, because Rex Tillerson was also very critical of the way in which Donald Trump handled that G20 meeting with Vladimir Putin, reportedly, I should add, because even though Rex Tillerson was much reported, we remember having links with Russia, he even holds the Russian Order of Friendship, he actually felt he was stunned, apparently, he told an associate, by the way that Donald Trump began that meeting with Vladimir Putin. Donald Trump is reported to have said, "I'm going to get this out of the way, did you do this?" Of course, in reference to Russian meddling in the US election. But that was not apparently what Rex Tillerson wanted him to do. He wanted him to be a lot stronger in his approach. Now, when he went and spoke in public, he towed the party line, or the president's line, saying that it was a robust and lengthy exchange, but it would appear that perhaps things were a little different behind closed doors. Just how different? Well, maybe we're going to have to wait for the autobiography for that one.
Of course, Rex Tillerson's visit is now being overshadowed by what's happening with Donald Trump Jr. And you mentioned Russia, that meeting with a Russian attorney in June of 2016.
Yes, and Donald Trump Jr. has been giving his side of the story. He has said that in retrospect, perhaps he would have done things a little differently, but he has said it was simply opposition research and shouldn't be viewed as anything more than that. His father has been tweeting in his defense today, saying that his son did a good job in that television interview, being open, transparent and innocent. He says this is the greatest witch hunt in political history. Sad. But he then went on to say that, remember when you hear the words sources say from the fake media, oftentimes those sources are made up and do not exist. Now, this raised a lot of our eyebrows online, unsurprisingly, because as Nick Kristof of the New York Times is quick to point out, the source was your son's own emails, copied to Jared Kushner, of course, the son-in-law of Donald Trump. And Nick Kristof is asking, what was fake? The 8 denials from you and your aides. Now, he goes into great detail in this particular article about the Trumps basically embracing this Russian plot. And what he has said in this article is that this is duplicity on top of collusion. Some very strong words. There have been even stronger words and condemnation from the late-night US comedians. I've got a couple of clips to show you here. Take a listen.
Trump Jr. thought if he could be transparent, unlike crooked Hillary, and share his emails, people would be like, huh, what an honest guy. The only problem is, once you read the emails, they prove the collusion that Jr.'s been denying all along.
So, Donald Trump Jr. gave us the dots. All we have to do is to connect them to see where this is going. Oh, yeah. He's going to jail.
So there's very strong implications there. Stephen Colbert pulling no punches. As far as he's concerned, a crime has been committed. But it's not quite as clear-cut as that. The Washington Post is among those to have looked at whether or not a legal line has been crossed here. They say that collusion is not a legal term, it is a political one, which is an interesting thing to point out. There is no line in the criminal code that says that you go to jail for colluding with a foreign adversary. But you can go to jail for conspiring with a foreign adversary to influence or undermine an election. Now, they've spoken to a lawyer who says that Trump Jr., as far as he's concerned, may well have crossed that legal line. So this is going to be one that will not be wrapped up anytime soon.
All right, Emma James, many thanks. And of course, tomorrow, guess who's in Paris?
Indeed.
Donald Trump. We'll be talking about it in the debate at this time tomorrow. Many thanks for joining us. I want to thank our panel once again, and thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.